Okay, friends, things are a bit of a mess right now, and frankly, I'm a little bit frightened of the future. The fires are still raging out west. Our president has indicated that he may not concede to a peaceful transfer of power if he are to lose the election in November. None of the officers involved in the shooting death of Breonna Taylor were charged with murder. Oh, and we can't forget about the worldwide pandemic that has already killed over 200,000 people in the United States. Dumpster fire is the phrase that comes to mind. Well, it's the most sermon-appropriate phrase that comes to mind. And it's at times like this that I, as a pastor, like to turn to Scripture. Now, I should probably say that I look to the Bible for reassurance of God's love and go to passages that remind me of God's faithfulness and care and point me to the bigger picture and offer peace. The truth, though, is I find myself most appreciating stories like the one Jenny just shared. Stories from thousands of years ago and thousands of miles away where, just like today, everything is a hot mess. Where people are unjust and arrogant and petty, where none of the characters are particularly commendable, and just when you think it's really bad, it manages to get worse. The story that we're looking at today is a troubling story, and part of the fault, of course, lies with Jacob, who is also called Israel. I mean, not only does he pick a favorite child, but he makes it very clear to all the children who the favorite child is, Joseph, by giving him a fancy robe and apparently letting him just hang out at home while all his brothers go out in the field and work. This is not a healthy family dynamic that Jacob sets up. And of course, Joseph could have handled it better, right? The truth is, he seems like kind of a brat. Just before the reading for today, Joseph brings a bad report about his brothers to Jacob. And we don't know for sure if this report was true or not true, but the Hebrew word that is used here, when it's used in other places, tends to refer to gossip or plotting or misinformation. And then Joseph tells his brothers about this dream he had, a dream that obviously suggests he's going to rule over all of them. He wears his fancy special dad robe when he goes out into the wilderness to find them. I mean, Joseph is 17 at this point. He should know better. The brothers, though, they're not particularly commendable either. They see Joseph coming, and their first response is, hey, let's kill him and throw him in the pit. That seems a bit of an extreme response, no matter how bratty your brother might be. Now, Reuben, the oldest, does suggest that they just throw him in the pit without killing him first, which I suppose is a minor improvement to the original plan. He doesn't divulge to them his plan to go back and get Joseph out of the pit later, which leaves the door open for Judah's final successful plan to sell Joseph into slavery so they could at least get a little bit of spending money out of the deal. And we can't forget about the Midianites heading to Egypt, who are just apparently casually buying human beings on their way. This whole thing reminds me of a line in William Butler Yeats' poem, The Second Coming. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. It's hard to see where God is in this story. It's hard to discern a moral or glean any words of inspiration or solace. Yet for me, it's somehow comforting nonetheless to realize that this time we are living in, even though it seems uniquely awful and terrible and horrific, is in the grand scheme of things just your run-of-the-mill mess that humans tend to make of the world. Despite how it feels, 2020 USA does not win any Lifetime Achievement Awards for most corrupt leaders, most unjust systems, most dysfunctional relationships, or even most violent tendencies. I mean, frankly, I think we could legitimately get a nomination, but these stories in the Bible, they remind us just how stiff the competition is. The Bible also reminds me that these terrible, petty, violent, unjust people are, in fact, God's people. And God is there even if we can't see it, and even if they are not listening. Of course, the story does not end here with Joseph in slavery and Jacob in tears. Through some exciting twists and turns, Joseph moves out of his position as a slave into a high-ranking role in the court of Pharaoh. He predicts, based on Pharaoh's dreams, that Egypt will experience 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And Joseph is put in charge of managing the food storage so that there will be enough to eat in the lean years. When the famine comes, as predicted, Jacob sends his sons, Joseph's brothers, to Egypt to buy grain. And eventually, after some more sibling dysfunction and more crying, there's a lot of crying in these stories, Joseph tells his brothers who he is. He reveals his identity and is reunited with his father. So then Joseph's family, his brothers, his dad moves to Egypt, and eventually Jacob dies. That then brings us to the last chapter of Genesis, which is the second part of our reading from today. It's from Genesis 50, chapters 15 to 21. Realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, "What if Joseph still bears us a grudge and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him?" So they approached Joseph, saying, "Your father gave this instruction when he died. Say to Joseph, I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong that they did in harming you. Now, therefore, please forgive the crime of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept, fell down before him, and said, "We are here as your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, as God is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." In this way he reassured them, speaking kindly. Now this is a welcome shift right from that earlier story of Joseph and his brothers. Where there were grudges, there's now forgiveness. Where there was arrogance, there's now care. Where there was cruelty, there's now kindness. And yet, this too is a troubling passage for me, not so much because of what is happening in the passage itself, but because of what we will learn when we turn the page to Exodus. The Israelites, the descendants of Joseph and his 11 brothers, multiply and fill the land of Egypt. But eventually, a new king arose in Egypt who did not know Joseph, and the Israelites become the slaves of the Egyptians. Knowing what is to come, there's a dark irony in the brothers' words to Joseph, "We are here as your slaves." Joseph, of course, rejects this offer of servitude, but it comes to pass anyway in future generations. Even though Joseph doesn't want to enslave his people, he has unknowingly laid the groundwork for their enslavement. He has designed and implemented an economic system that puts farmers and other laborers at the mercy of the rich and powerful. He is a complicit participant in a ruling body that uses intimidation and incarceration against people who present any kind of offense or threat to power. Joseph doesn't want his brothers to be slaves, but the system he has helped to create and uphold is a system of exploitation and oppression that too easily devolves into slavery. Considering this warm scene of the reunited brothers against the bleak opening chapter of Exodus has gotten me thinking about unintended consequences, about complicity, and particularly my white complicity in systems that enact oppression and violence. We are all, I trust, horrified by the killing of Breonna Taylor and the lack of accountability for the officers who killed her. an innocent woman was shot in her home to death, and nobody is charged with murder. We're heartbroken that this has happened, and yet, in many ways, this is the logical outcome of the criminal justice system our white ancestors designed, and those of us who are white have benefited from for generations. We are all, I trust, concerned about issues of poverty, about unhoused people, lack of access to health care, growing income inequality, but isn't poverty an inevitable reality in the capitalist economy that is so central to U.S. identity, that's so much a part of our greatness? And we are all, I trust, aware that the unusual intensity of the blazing fires out west is a result of human-aided global warming. We care about how our actions affect our planet, and the vast majority of us rely on fossil fuels to maintain our lifestyles, even to participate in worship, whether it's online or in person. The point here is not to denigrate the U.S. justice system or capitalism or our energy infrastructure. I frankly don't have the expertise or the time to fully examine and critique the roles that these systems play in the problems that we're currently facing. The point right now is to suggest that our actions have consequences, not just for today or for next week, but for generations to come. The point is that the kindling and fuel for this dumpster fire that is 2020 has been accumulating for a very long time. The point is that we can be blind to the larger systemic forces at work, paying more attention to meeting immediate needs than we do to establishing community practices that will truly sustain us for the long haul. Earlier in this biblical story, one of the parts we skipped over, Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams. 7 fat cows consumed by 7 skinny cows, 7 plump ears of grain devoured by 7 scraggly ears of grain. Rabbi Arthur Waskow notes that while Joseph says he will consult God about these dreams, what happens is that Joseph just jumps right in and interprets them on his own and comes up with his own plan of action. Egypt will experience 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And so Joseph's solution is to have the government stockpile grain for the first 7 years and then sell it back to the people during the next 7 years. And this plan does provide food for the people when the famine hits, but it is also a vehicle for economic exploitation. As Rabbi Waskow points out, it was not the only path that was possible for saving the people from famine. Maybe if Joseph had truly listened to God, he would have heard the instructions that his ancestors will hear later in Exodus about letting the land rest every 7 years. And the famine maybe could have been prevented entirely. Or maybe he would have heard a plan from God about how to feed people that didn't lead to widespread poverty and eventual slavery. In this final scene that we read, Joseph asks his brothers, "Am I in the place of God?" And it reads as a rhetorical question, but there is a sense in which Joseph actually puts himself in the place of God. At the very least, Joseph is serving a ruler who expects to be treated as a god. So I think that the story of Joseph gives us a lot to think about in our current context. Even as we are being kind, are we enabling systems that do violence? Are we so focused on today and tomorrow and next month and next year that we're inadvertently setting the groundwork for problems for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren? How do we faithfully live in a culture that regards some leaders as gods? And how do we avoid seeking a God-like role for ourselves and our people in the process of working against those other leaders? And are we truly listening to the voice of God? I don't find any clear answers from the story of Joseph, but I do take some comfort in the questions. Some comfort in the fact that pride, jealousy, pettiness, obliviousness, family tensions have been a part of the human condition since the beginning. Some comfort in the fact that dumpster fires have been flaring up all over the world for the past few thousand years. We are in, if not good company, at least substantial company. And I take comfort in the fact that God has been with God's people through it all, providing for our survival, leading us to kindness, ready to speak to those who would listen. I take comfort in the fact that despite what Pharaoh might claim, and despite all those people willing to worship him, there is, in fact, one true God. And that God is a God of peace, a God of love, a God of justice. Amen.